On a cold December morning, there was a man running along the Danube Canal in Vienna's 3rd district. It was 6:14. The man stopped, caught his breath, and looked at his phone. A single word on the screen: "Run!" At that moment, 200 meters away, a parked car's window rolled down and a single shot was fired. The man fell to the ground. His blood slowly spread across the icy pavement. Nobody heard. Nobody saw. The operation lasted 47 seconds. But nobody knew that the dead man was not just a diplomat. The operation's code name, the Vanishing Voice. The dead man's name was Anton Weiss, 42 years old, a mid-level official at the Austrian Foreign Ministry, married, father of 2, a quiet life. But his real identity was far darker. For the past 6 years, Weiss had been working for an Eastern European intelligence service. His task was simple: encrypt and transmit information leaked from NATO meetings, quiet, regular, invisible. But 3 months ago, something changed. Weiss decided to sell a document in his possession, a list. It contained names, 14 deep-cover operatives working in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. These names didn't appear in any records. They were shadow operators. Some had been hiding under diplomatic immunity for years. Others were just a code and a fake passport. Weiss wanted to take this list to a buyer. Price: €2.4 million. But finding him triggered a joint operation of 6 intelligence agencies. Weiss didn't notice when the surveillance began. The first signal came a month ago in Budapest. Weiss met with Mikhail Sokolov, a former Soviet diplomat. The meeting took place in a museum. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. Footage was captured. Audio was not recorded. However, behavioral profile was analyzed. Weiss was tense, anxious, and rushed. When intelligence analysts read this profile, they understood something. The man was about to make a sale. From that day on, Weiss's life was examined under a microscope. Every step, every coffee break, every phone call, equipment was tracked, digital footprint was scanned, every file on his office computer was secretly copied. But the list could not be found, because Weiss wasn't storing the list in any digital format. The list was on paper. The unit running the operation was a silent and invisible team. Most operations were conducted through multinational coordination, but this time was different. At the center of the operation was a woman, Mira Kovac. Mira, of Balkan origin, 34 years old, known in the intelligence world only by a code, Silent Line. She was a legendary tracker in the field. She didn't speak. She was invisible. Targets never became aware of her presence. Her operations were surgical and flawless. But there was a deep crack inside Mira. 7 years ago, during an operation in Sarajevo, her partner was killed. That night, while Mira was hiding in a room, she heard the sound of her partner's death. She couldn't do anything, because the operational rules were such: don't move, hide, accept death. Since that day, Mira never worked with a partner. She chose solo operations, cold, distant, professional. But the Weiss file was going to connect her to a team again. The operation plan had 4 phases. Phase 1, track Weiss, identify the meeting point. Phase 2, identify the buyer, map the network. Phase 3, seize the list at the moment of transfer. Phase 4, neutralize Weiss and the buyer. But nobody anticipated that the list was just a trap. Mira first saw Weiss on a Vienna tram. The man looked nervous, a newspaper in his left hand, a bag in his right. The bag was light. The list wasn't there. Mira understood this. Weiss was carrying the bag only as a prop. She followed Weiss for 3 days. The man drank his morning coffee at the same cafe, walked in the same park, used the same metro line. But one night, at 23:47, Weiss made an unexpected move. He left his house, walked, entered an old church. Mira couldn't follow him inside. The church was empty. Only an elderly priest was there. Weiss stayed inside for 8 minutes. When he came out, his hands were empty. Mira understood. The list was there. The next morning, Mira secretly entered the church. The building was old and dark. The interior was lit with candles, stone floor, damp walls. The priest was gone. Mira advanced slowly. She scanned every corner. Then she saw it. A confession booth. She entered the booth. There was a small crack in the wall. One of the cracks had shifted slightly. Mira pushed the stone with her hand and removed it. Inside was a small metal box. She opened the box. There were 3 papers inside. The papers were handwritten. Names, code names, location details. But as Mira took the list, she noticed something. The paper wasn't new. The writing was slightly faded. There was an old date stamp on the paper, 1987. At that moment she understood. This list wasn't real. This was a fake, a trap, a game. But it was too late, because outside someone was waiting for her. As she exited the church, Mira saw 2 men facing her. Both were in civilian clothes, but their posture and gaze gave everything away. These were professional operators. Mira stopped. The men approached. One spoke in German. "Drop the list, slowly." Mira didn't answer. Scenarios were racing through her mind. Run, attack, surrender. Each option had risks. But at that moment, a gunshot was heard from afar. One of the men fell to the ground. The second man turned and fired. Mira used this opportunity. She ran. Who had fired? Who was this third party? But Mira didn't stop to think. She disappeared into the streets. That night Mira returned to her safe house. The safe house was an old apartment in one of Vienna's peripheral neighborhoods. The interior was minimal. A desk, a computer, a few devices. Mira examined the list again. She tested the age of the papers, performed ink analysis. The results were shocking. The papers were at least 30 years old. This list belonged to the Cold War era. But why would someone try to sell a 30-year-old list now? She found the answer near dawn. The list wasn't fake. The list was real. But the names on it weren't dead. The names were being actively protected, because these names were intelligence operators who had been in deep cover for years, over 60 years old, but still working in critical positions. They hadn't been retired, hadn't been archived. They had simply been forgotten. And now someone wanted to expose them. It was 36 hours before Weiss died. Mira transmitted her report to headquarters, but the instruction that came back was unexpected. Abort the operation. Pull back. Mira froze. Why? Why was it being stopped now? She got the answer at midnight, in an encrypted message. The message came from an anonymous source. You won't be the one to kill Weiss, but someone will, because that list is just a tool. The real target is something else. When Mira read this message, her blood ran cold, because now she understood. Weiss wasn't a target. Weiss was bait, and the real operation hadn't started yet. The next morning, Weiss was killed, on the edge of the Danube Canal, single bullet, professional execution. But in the police file, the incident was written differently. Random act of violence, suspect sought. The media reported it 12 hours later. Diplomat killed in street. The file was closed. Nobody conducted a deep investigation, because they weren't allowed to. Mira watched the operation's closure, but something bothered her. When Weiss died, there was nothing on him. The list was also missing. So someone had taken the list before Mira. But who? The answer came 3 days later, with another death in Berlin. The deceased was Mikhail Sokolov. He died in a house fire. Official statement, accident. But Mira knew this was no accident. Someone was cleaning up the trail. Mira began investigating on her own. She followed the list's trail, checked which names were still active. Of the 14 names, 9 were still alive, but none appeared in the files. Mira chose one name, Georg Feldman, 67 years old, retired diplomat, officially working at a small consulting firm in Berlin, but in reality Feldman had conducted covert operations in the Middle East for years. Mira went to Berlin to find him. She found Feldman at a cafe, an old, tired, quiet man. Mira approached him, sat at the table. Feldman looked at her and smiled. "I was expecting you." Mira was surprised. "How?" Feldman took a sip of his coffee. "Because I was once like you. I always know when I'm being followed." Mira asked directly, "Where's the list?" Feldman didn't answer. He just pulled out a small piece of paper from his pocket. An address was written on the paper. "Go there. You'll find your answers there." "Who are you?" Feldman stood up. "I'm someone who's been forgotten. And you're about to be forgotten too." Then he left. The address was in an old industrial area in northern Berlin. Mira went there at midnight. The building was abandoned. Inside was dark and silent. Mira entered. She scanned the surroundings with her flashlight. Then she saw a door. The door was locked, but the lock was broken. She went inside. The room was small. Old photographs hung on the walls. The photos were from the 1980s. People, meetings, secret encounters. And then Mira saw a file on a desk. She opened the file. There were hundreds of documents inside, but one page stood out. Operation Vanishing Voice, 1987, Termination Report. Mira read the page, and her blood froze, because this operation was a game that had secretly created that list in 1987. The objective was simple: give fake names to enemy intelligence services, trap them, and then eliminate them. But the operation was left unfinished because the Cold War ended, and now someone wanted to restart that old game. As Mira closed the file, she heard a voice behind her. "Glad you found it." She turned. A man stood before her, in his 50s, in a suit, calm. The man continued, "I'm your boss's boss, and now I'm offering you a choice. Either give me this file and forget it, or never leave this room." Mira listened to him, then asked, "Why? Why is this list important now?" The man smiled. "Because the world has changed. Old enemies are now allies. Old allies are now enemies. And some people don't want old names exposed, because those names disrupt today's power balance." Mira understood. The list wasn't just names. The list was political dynamite. The man extended his hand. "Give me the file." Mira gave him the file. The man took the file and left the room. Mira watched him go, and at that moment she understood that she too would now be someone forgotten. The operation officially closed. Weiss's file was archived. Sokolov's death was recorded as an accident. The list disappeared. Feldman returned to his retirement. Mira was quietly transferred to another city. New identity, new assignment. But what she experienced that night in Berlin never left her, because there was something else in that file, a detail. Mira still remembered it. On the last page of the file, a note was written. "The forgotten never die. They only wait." And Mira knew that one day these words would come true. 3 months later. Mira returned to routine at her new posting. Tracking, analysis, reports. Everything was normal. But one morning she found an anonymous envelope on her desk. She opened the envelope. Inside was a single photograph. The photograph showed Feldman. But he was no longer an old man. Young, in his 30s, in uniform. And on the back of the photograph was a note. "Are you next?" Mira burned the photograph, threw the ashes out the window. But the cold feeling inside never went away, because in the intelligence world, no file ever truly closes. It only gets postponed.